Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I am your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again Alasdair Macleod. Alasdair has a background as a stockbroker, as a banker, and as an economist. He is a senior fellow at Gold Money Foundation, and he writes many thought-provoking articles there for Gold Money, goldmoney.com. I highly recommend you go there to pick up Alasdair's material and other writers there as well. But Alasdair, I think, is really the top of the game there, and I really enjoy his insights, very thought-provoking insights, and we're certainly going to hear about some of those today, I hope. Welcome, Alasdair. Thanks for being with me again.
That's my pleasure, Jay.
Always good to talk to you. I would like to start out by asking you to comment on several points from your April 20th article that was posted at Gold Money, titled America's Financial War Strategy. Now, you started out the article by noting that President Trump has done about a 180-degree turn from his campaign rhetoric in which he suggested that there was no longer any need for NATO, or at least if there is a NATO, that doesn't need to be so aggressive, and every country should pay their own way, of course, he said, and America is sick and tired of paying for Europe's defense and all of that sort of thing. He suggested that maybe it might be better if wouldn't it be nice if we got along with Russia, he said, rather than fighting with them. What would be wrong with trading with Russia and other countries that we consider to be our enemies? Maybe they don't have to be. That was sort of the message I got, and quite frankly, the reason I personally voted for Donald Trump, not because I loved his personality by any means, but because I thought he was saying some of the right things. And lo and behold, 180-degree turn. He's about as aggressive as every bit as aggressive as Hillary Clinton would have been, it seems. But maybe that will become obvious why, and I think it will as we continue our discussion. But can you maybe just review some of the things that Trump has done since in the short time he's been in the White House? He's really guns a-blazing, right?
Yes, you're right, Jay. He's turned from peacenik to warmonger. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a remarkable transformation. Yeah. And I don't know whether this is because the deep state has got to him and sort of told him the facts of life, or what. But I would suspect that there is quite, if you like, a sort of a turf war going on between Langley, which of course is where your security services are based, and the White House. So I think that is a watch this space. But no, you're right to mention the various things that he's done. I mean, the first thing he did was do a joint operation with the Emirati commandos in the Yemen, and a Navy SEAL got killed, and that was very, very unfortunate. And that mission was a failure. He then sent missiles in against a Syrian airfield on reports that the Syrians had deployed chemical weapons, including sarin gas. But the trouble is, with all this, we don't know whether it's true or not. You've got, the intelligence services telling us what's happened. But, intelligence services are in the business of dissembling information. I mean, do we believe them or what? This is the trouble. Yeah. After that, of course, he then turned 180 degrees on North Korea. Originally, he was talking about, I'm going to meet the leader of North Korea, and we're going to talk about it, and I'm going to see what his problems are. Then he starts ramping up, sending aircraft carriers there, and all the rest of it. Then he bombs eastern Afghanistan with this enormous bomb and takes out ISIS people in the tunnels there. Then I think troops are being dispatched to fight ISIS in northern Iraq and eastern Syria. And then that's 5. And since I wrote that article, he's now sent more troops, or he's agreed to be sending more troops to Afghanistan to bolster the regime there. And, of course, rumbling in the background, there is the sort of saber rattling against Iran, which has picked up a little bit. That's gone from the news a little bit. But you're right. Your comment that he's turned round completely is absolutely right. And there are 6 pieces of evidence in support of what you're saying.
In your article, America's Financial War Strategy, you mentioned the name of a major general, I think Xiao Yong, if I'm pronouncing it right, in the People's Liberation Army, whose views you suggest carry some considerable weight among the Chinese government. Can you tell us a little bit about this gentleman and his geoeconomic views?
Yes. He along with one of his colleagues, was the joint author of a book on strategy that was launched in 1999. But more recently, he produced a paper which was released by the Chinese government, and so it was obviously approved for release by the Chinese government, really detailing how the Chinese see, and particularly this gentleman, Xiaoyang, sees American strategy and why they're doing it. And really the burden of his song is that the real war that America fights all the time is effectively financial, and it's all about using the dollar for domestic benefit. Dollars can be printed for export, which is if you like, transfers resources to America. Equally, when they need to borrow dollars, what they do is they shake out dollar ownership from being used abroad into being reinvested into treasuries. And Xiaoyang describes this as basically being a process. It's rather like a sort of a pump and dump, if you like. But the process really on the bond side is you make other investments, dollar investments, appear risky, so that people who are outside America owning dollars will redeploy their dollars to invest in treasuries. And that has been, one of the reasons why there's been such a build-up of reserves abroad invested in U.S. treasuries. So he describes a cycle, if you like, which we would call, I think, pump and dump in the markets.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I've been around long enough to remember some of these cycles, the Latin American crisis being one, the Asian crisis coming afterwards. These are cycles that have some duration, I think, maybe something like 10 years or something like that, Alistair?
That's right. I mean, part of this is, periods of dollar weakness and periods of dollar strength. The Latin American crisis was, I think, actually, the root of it was the requirement for the Fed to deal with credit flows and inflation in America. So I think the crisis, if you like, wasn't a pump and dump to screw Latin America. Far from it. If anything, America at that time was far more interested in keeping Latin America on side. So this is where I disagree with Xiaoyang, but having said that, the net effect is the same. But what came out of that, call it Xiaoyang's pump and dump, is obviously we had the coups d'etats in Chile, after Allende screwed everything up, and then we had the coup d'etat in Argentina, which led to the invasion of the Falklands and all the rest of it. So that you can see that these actions, if you like, these dollar flows, are destabilizing. And you had the same thing in the Asian crisis, which started with the Thai baht having a run against it in, I think it was 1995, and that spread to the other major economies in the area, particularly the Philippines, Malaysia, and also, of course, Indonesia. And there again, that chased dollars, if you like, into U.S. treasuries out of investments in that area. That area had been booming. I mean, people were building factories and all the rest of it. I mean, the whole of the area was really undergoing an industrial revolution and manufacturing cheap goods for America and the rest of the world. And, all financed out of dollars, or alternatively by Japanese companies who were expanding their production out of Japan into Southeast Asia. So it was a very, very severe knock against Southeast Asia. And Xiaoyang makes the point that China avoided being hurt in that because she didn't have any dollars.
She didn't have any dollars. She has been pretty protective of her banking industry as well, I think, Alistair, right? China?
Yes, she has. I mean, the banks. This is an interesting point you raise, because the banks are owned by the state, and so it's not like, if you like, a publicly owned bank or a private sector owned bank that we would have in America or in Europe, expanding credit and then finding that, it's got a problem because there's a credit bubble, it starts imploding because of all the malinvestment, all the rest of it. Yes, we get the malinvestment, but because the bank is owned by the state can direct ways in which the malinvestment is handled. So the crisis, which lots of hedge fund investors in America expect to happen in Japan, hasn't happened because of the control element that the state has over the overall banking system. That's the fundamental difference.
Yeah. So, what we have here then, it seems to me, Alistair, and I think this was brought out in your article, is that you have this pump and dump. So when you pull the rug out from underneath these countries or these areas of the world, their prices really plummet, and then that paves the way to go back in and use those dollars that are created out of nothing to go in and buy these cheap assets a lot of times too, right? So it's an expansion, an empire expansion process, as well as funding the treasury then when the air goes out.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think a very good example of this was we go back to the Latin American situation, where after the region had collapsed financially, you had the issuance of Brady bonds, which were the means by which American institutions managed to get back into the region and acquire assets really relatively cheaply. So, I'm not sure. I think the Brady bonds actually was to deal with a bad debt situation, which was really afflicting the banks, and particularly the American banks, who were owed a hell of a lot of money. But the way that the Chinese see this is, what they're doing is they're crashing the economy and they're getting in cheap. Now, we can say it is the same effect. I would read it differently, but I would agree with the net effect is pretty well as Xiaoyang says.
Right. So it's a matter of intent that you see somewhat differently than he does, apparently.
Yeah.
But Alistair, I think one of the most striking remarks that Xiao made, you mentioned in your article, he suggested that Nixon taking gold away from the dollar and from the international monetary system in 1971 was a bigger event in the 20th century than World War I and World War II. That's a remarkable statement. Now, it's something that I have felt is far more important than everybody understands. I think most people don't understand that the empire has been able to expand and commit all these and be involved in all these wars around the world because we've been able to create money out of nothing, and also the pump and dump scenario that you were just talking about. So to me, it makes sense. But for someone like that to say this was a bigger event than World War I and World War II is remarkable, I think, don't you?
Yes, isn't it fascinating?
Yeah.
I mean, here am I in England, and London got bombed, the town down the road from me, Exeter, got bombed, and all the rest of it. I would take issue with that statement. But having said that, I see where he's coming from, and certainly in financial terms, coming off, or if you like, the end of the Bretton Woods Agreement was a very major economic event. You've only got to look at the price of commodities to see what the effect has been of the previous pricing, effectively in gold through the medium of the dollar, of commodities. They were very, very stable. Oil is the obvious example. And then we come, gold is gone from the scene because it can no longer be maintained. And then what happens to prices? Prices start rocketing for all basic materials. And, of course, we ended up with the threat of hyperinflation developing in this country in the 70s and in America also in the later 70s. So, the turn of events from that one action of, the Nixon shock actually has had a major impact ever since. And it really, really is major. So in that sense, I would agree with him, but I would take issue about the World War things. And I also wonder, I mean, the Japanese invaded Manchuria and all the rest of it. So I think, he obviously feels very strongly about that. And remember that this is sanctioned by the Communist Party leadership too. So that is a view which they would like to push forward. And
Right.
I think the reason they're doing this, just as an aside, is so that every time America goes and sort of says, now, who are we going to pump and dump now, that other countries have been warned. And I think particularly, and this is relevant to today, we're looking at both South Korea and Japan. Now, they, I think, are, under this analysis, the real targets for America's aggression against North Korea. Because any money that's in Japan or South Korea, any dollar money, if you like, that's in the ownership there, is likely to move over to U.S. Treasuries. Now, this is important because if you're going to fund this increased deficit, which is Trump's immediate monetary problem, financial problem, then it can only be done on a slight rise in interest rates, not a significant rise in interest rates, because if you get a significant rise in interest rates, you crash the system. So this is all about making alternative investments to U.S. Treasuries look even more risky than they are at the moment.
All right, so this may be then, I think, getting back to the point that I was making early in our discussion, the notion of why Trump has done a 180-degree turn here on foreign policy relates to the need to keep the safe haven image in the minds of people around the world. And how do you do that? If you can't do it with economics, you do it with wars or threats of wars or military incursions or what? That's also what the Chinese see, right?
That is how the Chinese would see it on this analysis, and I suspect that is one of the things that I think Langley would be looking at as a means of continuing the status quo, because America has a huge problem. You've got a very unpredictable president, and goodness knows what's going to happen, what he's going to turn around and do tomorrow, the day after, next month. But the one thing you do have is you're right up against the debt ceiling. The amount of debt in the U.S. economy and in other currencies which regard the dollar as a reference point, the amount of debt is just absolutely enormous. We cannot afford to have a significant rise in interest rates. So to go and borrow heavily in the markets has got to be a very controlled operation, and war can be used as a means of trying to keep that cost down.
Yeah, maybe somebody left him know that you can't be a peacemaker here if you want to keep money coming back to the Treasury. So very, very interesting insights there. One I certainly hadn't thought of until I read your excellent article. Your second article I'd like to ask you about, to comment on a bit, is End of Empire. In that article you stated, and I quote, "Already China dominates world trade. Her own economy is already significantly larger than that of the U.S. on a purchasing power parity estimate. While being the largest consumer of raw materials, China also exports more finished goods by value than any other country," end of quote. Well, I believe that China has been very slowly reducing its holdings of dollars, from what I can tell. I saw statistics recently that suggested that foreigners over the last 2 years have reduced their holdings of treasuries by 12.5%. But your End of Empire article suggests that given Trump's newfound warmongering modus operandi, that China and Russia may no longer have the luxury of waiting as they have been. You know, China's not wanted to dump their treasuries. They own so many of them. They don't want to. I mean, it'd be like some major stockholder selling all his stocks and watching it go to zero. The Chinese don't want to do that. So they've been patient, but you're suggesting that given some of Trump's actions recently, maybe North Korea and other things, and, you know, sending ships around the world and everything, that maybe they feel like they don't have the time, the luxury of time. Could you talk about that a bit?
Yes, certainly. This is actually a very, very complex issue. Basically, what the Chinese are planning to do is to gradually dispose of the dollars in their reserves, which include U.S. treasuries and treasury bills, and to reinvest the proceeds in the raw materials that they need for their plans to develop the One Belt, the spice trail route. In fact, there are two of those. There's the land one and there's the one going around the sea. And also the associated development in the region. There's also a lot of infrastructure development to be conducted within China. I mean, one of the things which they plan to do, for example, is to upgrade the electricity grid system, which is going to require a lot of copper. Now, things are being put on hold slightly because obviously the wealth management products in China, these are sort of speculative funds, if you like, that play whatever market is the thing to play at the time. They have been effectively front-loading ahead of the Chinese government, or front-running the Chinese government's purchases of commodities. So the first thing that the Chinese government is now doing is basically winding down these wealth management product speculations. There is obviously no interest in having them front-run the state's purchases. So that, in a sense, has put things on hold. The other thing that has actually emerged, which modifies the story slightly, is that I was very interested to see that America has come to a trade agreement with China over financial services, and a few sort of and agricultural products and so on. Now, it's actually quite minor stuff, but I think it's actually a very, very important marker, if you like, for the relationship between Donald Trump and President Xi. There's no doubt about it. They got on very well when they met in Florida. And I would say this of President Xi: he strikes me as being a man with quite a lot of charisma, and he's the sort of person who I think, meet him in the flesh and you think, my goodness, this is a man and a half. I mean, what an interest, So I can see Trump being turned, if you like, in that sense. What we are seeing, I think, and this is the turf war that you have in the White House, we're seeing Trump still pursuing, I want to talk to these guys, I want to work with these guys, I want to come to agreements with these guys. And you've got Langley, who are very cautious on the other side, saying, look, Mr. President, this is not realistic. Equally, you had Lavrov visited the White House, I think it was last week, and they had, I think, probably quite productive conversations, and that certainly is likely to lead up to a meeting with President Putin. So, the idea that the Trump sort of, if you like, sort of peacenik approach is dead and buried isn't quite right. But he's having to fight to get it through, his security advisors and all the rest of it. So we saw, we've seen one head roll, Comey. There could well be other heads to roll as well, but it's going to be very much watch this space. So coming back to your question about China, I think that the Chinese, in terms of selling down their dollars and buying the commodities, and maybe getting to a point where they can bring gold into the picture, which basically would be very bad for the dollar and undermine their dollar position. That, I think, is on the back burner a little bit for the moment. But there is no doubt about it that China's overall strategy, geopolitical strategy for the rest of Asia, is progressing very much as she forecast in her 13th five-year plan. And only this week, there was the meeting in Beijing where I think something like 60 countries attended, where China laid down her plans for the spice route. Right. Interestingly, India, which is a very, very important component of this, refused to attend. Her nose was pointed out of joint because, of course, China has been investing in a lot of money in developing Karachi as a port. Yeah. And so President Modi is very upset about that because, of course, they're deadly enemies. But, get over it, Modi. I think is the message.
Well, Alistair, with limited amount of time here, just a couple of minutes left, the idea that China and Russia are amassing huge amounts of gold seems as though they are looking to build perhaps a financial structure that is solidly built on gold to compete against the United States and the U.S. dollar hegemony. Do you see it that way? And what does that mean for the dollar? What does that mean for gold? And then if you have 30 seconds perhaps to talk about gold money, just mention gold money.
Sure. Yes, I do see it as positive for gold. The problem that I think the Chinese have is that their currency is never going to really have international settlement credibility, if you like, without having something more punchy behind it. So, yes, gold does have a role, and China, bear in mind, has been secretly hoarding gold since 1983, when the People's Bank of China was appointed to act as the government's agent. So they've been doing it for a long time. Nobody knows how much gold they've got. I've speculated that the state's got about 20,000 tons. We know also that the private sector's bought a further anything between 12 and 15,000 tons. They've got a lot of gold. Russia is buying gold. India is desperately trying to get hold of gold from its own people, but they refuse to give it up. So you can see that gold is actually becoming very central to the largest trading bloc in the world.
Right, and gold money.
And that brings us to gold money. Well, I mean, we do two things, basically. The original gold money allows you to hold outside the banking system in your own ownership, vaulted for you, gold, silver, platinum, or palladium. And then we were acquired by what was called BitGold, has now rebranded itself into the Gold Money name, and that is a payment service which is actually run out of our Toronto office. And that means that you can, it's a very cost-effective way of buying gold. It costs 0.5% commission going in, 0.5% coming out. You can have a preloaded card which allows, it's a MasterCard, so you can spend your gold wherever you want, and it is an extremely useful facility. And the great thing is that if we have a systemic banking crisis, you still own your gold. It's not in the banking system. We pay for your insurance, and we pay for your storage fees.
All right, we'll have to leave it go at that. Alistair, thank you so much for being with us again. Always a pleasure having you.